Like and follow if you love horror. Her hands were bound and her feet were bound, but they weren't bound together. Amateurs. The only reason they kept getting the upper hand was on horror factor alone. Joan snagged one of her bootlaces and cut her bonds. There was only one thing left. She reached under the flap to the spare tire compartment, and when her hands found what they were looking for, she grinned. Her fingers tickled the handle of the Colt King Cobra and a box of rounds. Joan lay flat on her back, squared out her feet, and tried to imagine where the headrest of the front seat would be if she was to shoot through the back seat. She thought about how fast they were going, perhaps 75, 80 miles an hour from the sound. There was a lot to consider. Getting a clean shot on the driver, hoping the bullets wouldn't mushroom too much, and the chance the vehicle would spin out of control or flip. She took a steady breath, then fanned the hammer. 1 Mississippi. Joan released the cylinder. The car responded by jerking suddenly to the left. 2 Mississippi. Joan palmed the cylinder, releasing the spent rounds. The car bucked suddenly to the right, almost going on 2 wheels. 3 Mississippi. Joan thumbed around into the first chamber. The car fishtailed. 4 Mississippi. Joan thumbed a second round into the chamber. 2 would have to do. The car was clearly spinning out of control. The rear tires began squealing. 5 Mississippi. Joan slapped the cylinder into place. Someone threw the parking brake. Perhaps there was more than just the driver. "Oh, come on," Joan exclaimed as she threw the emergency release on the trunk and rolled out. It was nighttime. Without even moonlight to guide her, she knew she had seconds to guess where the next opponent would be. Joan knew she had shit for luck and moved around the right side of the vehicle. She steadied her breath and closed her right eye. As she did, 2 men stepped out, one from the front passenger side and the other from the rear passenger side. There was no time to steady her aim or plant her feet. She leveled the gun and shot. The first greaser head jerked back and sprayed blood, followed by the second. Joan rolled both bodies out of the way, slammed the door shut, and threw herself over the hood, ripped the dead driver out, jumped in, and sped off after the quickly dimming taillights in the distance. If that was the rest of them, she would need to be back behind them before anything looked odd. She would just follow them to whatever hell spat them out. It was time to dive into the lion's den. With Dustin, they could just disappear. Then God only knows where they'd show up. She held back as she followed, only staying close enough so they could make out her headlights in the rearview mirror and give them a false sense of comfort. Joan finally found the chink in their armor. They might have power, but they were fucking amateurs. They knew fuck all what to do with their power, and Joan knew just how to exploit that. Samuel was right after all. So far as Joan was concerned, suckers existed solely to be taken advantage of. Joan now had the element of surprise, and when she hit, she could hit hard. She just needed a quick angle of opportunity to strike. She followed them right into their nest, a large plantation-style estate with church and rectory. Joan slowed the car down, put it in second, and opened the door. She popped the trunk and simply stepped out. She snagged a box of bullets and some flares from the trunk as her Buick lazily wandered up the dirt road without her. She saluted before rolling off into the high grass. She watched as confused cultists tried to flag the car down, realized there was no one in it, then tried desperately to guide its direction. It caused quite a distraction before the greasers were smart enough to jump in the driver's seat and throw it out of gear. Samuel erupted from the lean car. He looked over the scene and scanned the dirt road leading to their installation. Joan had already made her way several yards around their perimeter. "Find her," Samuel raised his voice enough where he could be pretty sure Joan could hear it. "Make sure the master's final feeding is uninterrupted." 2 men dragged Dustin out of the rear of the lead car. It wasn't practically kicking and screaming, it was literally. Dustin was making a full-blown scene, throwing himself on the ground and making the 2 thugs dragging him by the legs while he clawed away. Like a toddler, he screamed and latched on to everything he could get his fingers into, occasionally forcing one of the thugs to pry his fingers up or step on them. The three eventually disappeared into the church. Within moments, the facility was crawling with cultists searching the grounds. However, they were used to people trying to get out, not trying to get in. By the time they'd fanned out to where Joan was, she'd already looped in. She went straight for the church around the back near the entrance to the rectory. The door was propped open, and Joan could easily look in to see what they were doing with Dustin. Two cultists were now 8, and they were fighting to bind him to a restraining board. Dustin flailed and thrashed like an alligator on a hook, but ultimately succumbed. They hoisted him up on their shoulders and carried him off. All that could be heard were the muffled cries. Now that Joan could see where Dustin was being taken, she needed to come up with a diversion. She thought about the installation and realized that most likely, most of the local farms, it probably ran on natural gas. It may even have a couple of its own gas wells. She would have to come up with a way to get the tank of gas to go up. She realized she was in a church and remembered an old-fashioned way to set up a makeshift fuse. Joan made her way around the wall under the stained glass windows portraying the Passion Play of Christ. She made her way to the back to the prayer candles and crossed her fingers. There she found a bundle of long-stemmed wooden matches coiled in a rubber band. The design was simple. One match extended from the bundle of the rest. Light it, and if lit at a slight angle, it would continue to burn towards the head of the other matches. Multiple matches could spark an exposed striking head on a flare leaned up against a gas hose. 3 main buildings, 3 flares, and enough matches to set them all off, pending they didn't get put out before they reached the exposed head of the flare. It was still night, but the slightest wind could put out a wooden match. It also didn't give her a lot of time, maybe a solid minute if set up right, if they even went off. She went out back of the church and quickly made her rounds between the 3 buildings. As she did, the scrambling cultists began to gather themselves and circle back inward on the estate. Joan was forced to dive in head first. As she went back into the church, she double-checked the cylinder of her revolver. She loaded up and headed down into the basement. Quickly as possible, she crept down a circular set of stairs. The subtle smell of ammonia began at the top, but quickly became thick enough to cut with a knife near the bottom. She choked back, retching, and did her best to breathe easy. It was so pungent she became disoriented for a moment. Slowly she crept forward into the basement, not knowing exactly what was waiting for her beyond the entrance. So far the coast was clear. The basement was well lit and empty, nothing more than a musty cement walls. She'd half expected sheet webs with people wrapped in cocoons, either that or some satanic ritual in progress. Towards the back there was another set of stairs down. Quietly as she could, Joan made quick work of them. This brought her to a dirt cellar. The 8 men who once held Dustin now stood abreast, facing down a black corridor. Dustin lay as an offering before its opening. There was something in the blackness, like a root planted firmly in the ground next to Dustin's head. But it was more than that. Joan couldn't quite make it out. Before Joan fully respect what she was looking at, another one just like it reached forward and planted itself next to Dustin's feet. These were not the roots of some tree above. These were appendages. They were spindly, but 5 times larger and semi-transparent. Joan couldn't identify them clearly in the low light because they lacked definition. 2 more hands reached forward and gripped Dustin's restraining board. 2 eyes flared alive in the darkness. They stared right at Joan, deep into her eyes. She found herself compelled to stare back. There was a sense of belonging, like a mother calling its child. A warm breath pushed out of the tunnel. As it breathed out, Joan breathed in. It filled her, took her mind to a place where she felt safe. She could feel its many hands caressing her, bathing her, lathering her in the oils of its royal jelly. She belonged. Her gun felt so heavy in her hand, but she closed her eyes and pushed away. There was a sense of disappointment as the 8 men turned around to face